Hello, how are you?
Doing fine. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. I'd want to spend some time today talking about something that's a little bit more um, broad, but more close to like what we have studied and what I study in particular, and part of what I teach in my classes. So something a little less attached to the immediate news and more along the lines of media literacies in general and digital media literacies and how we should understand the changing world of the media environments and why media literacy in its traditional context may not be working as well in our hyper mediated present. So I would love to talk about it with you because you and I have both have a background in studying media. I think you went to journalism school, right? And I went
Good.
to TV school. And so we were trained in traditional media in a world where both our jobs probably wouldn't be the same anymore. So what we learned isn't exactly applicable, but I think it's important for us to talk about it because in the general discussion space online and elsewhere, I think people are still struggling with the changes that are happening in media that have happened so rapidly since the pandemic stay at home period that we should just talk about it. Because what we've talked about for the last several episodes, we've basically been going on with the assumption that people know this, but I do think that we should give at least a little bit of a primer of where we come from. Let's give some background. I'll just really quick. I graduated as a TV major um, at a school in Long Island, and I became a TV producer, and I manipulated people on reality TV. So I learned media literacy backward. um, and what did you go? Where's your studies?
So I went to journalism school and then I actually pivoted out of the journalism program because that was as 24-hour news networks were really going for it. And I pivoted into film and television. And so, like you, I worked as a story producer on a reality TV show for a little bit, did some on set editing, and then ended up in marketing, which is essentially like being a story producer, but for product. So,
You're creating the narrative for somebody to make a consumer choice. Um, so I didn't know. I mean, to be clear, I mean, you and I are professionals. We have careers. I'm now a faculty, tenured faculty member. You're a marketing genius, and we're in a place where we know things. But when I was a student, I was pretty stupid. uh, I um, I didn't know what media literacy was at all. I that's why learning it sideways was not great. But when I went back to grad school, I was studying cultural studies, and I met my buddy Paul, who Paul Mielides, my mentor, who basically was like, "Hey, you know, when you're teaching your students about digital media, this is back when it was like YouTube was just a new thing and Twitter was just emerging." He goes, "You're technically doing media literacy," and I was like, "What?" And I started going to conferences about traditional media literacy, especially conferences like, namely, the National Association of Media Literacy Educators. And that really changed my outlook on all the pedagogy I've done ever since. I reframe it, of course, through digital media literacies, which is like, it includes the tool use, which is like the browser, the cell phone, and so forth. And then, of course, my book that just came out last year, Critical Internet Literacies, which is a deep dive further than what we'll talk about today. You know, that's like, maybe we'll touch on like the nuances of critical internet literacies, but it is a little bit different than media literacy. Now, when I learned it in the traditional way, and I'd like to hear if this is similar to what you learned. The traditional structure of media literacy is like a 5-part structure. It's really like they give this little map of how media literacies work. It's mistaken. Media literacy is often mistaken for media skills. And that's because a lot of people think of like media literacy as literacy, which is reading and writing, but that's a skill. Those are skills. We're not born, no human is born with the ability to read or write. Okay, that is, we're born with the ability to communicate. And so we have to be trained. How do you read? How do you convert thoughts into text? Which is like a crazy, when you think about that, it's like kind of crazy. Um, but that type of thing that's a skill set that can be learned and unlearned. If you were a heavy GPT user, you could unlearn it. But there is that skill set is actually something that has to be like practiced, and writing is different than typing, you know? So it is something that like requires upkeep. Traditional media literacy, like the actual media literacy, is about access, making sure you could get access to like the information itself, analyzing, which is being able to interpret meaning that comes from things, evaluating, which is very traditional. Okay, so evaluating is like, who is the author, what is the publication, what's its bias, what's all these things in there. And that's usually where media literacy like converts to now the literacies part of writing, which is creating, like being able to, if you own enough of that knowledge, you could then create media. And then acting, which is the most important part of media literacy. Okay, so traditional media literacy and all media literacies rely on the increase of agency, which is your ability to be a better actor in this world, whether that's civic actor or consumer choice. It's just, if you are good, if you have more media literacies, you make better choices. That makes you a better actor, makes you a better, have more agency of yourself. So if you're good at media literacy and all those steps that came before it, you can make better choices, which in theory sounds great. Unfortunately, it doesn't really give what's a bad choice. So we are now inundated with a world of rabbit holes where making a choice doesn't always mean the outcome is a positive action. So what I'd like to talk about today is where the limitations of traditional media literacy come across modern content that you and I do, content that you and I interact with or research, and what we can do or what takeaways we can offer that people can then start incorporating into their skill set, into their literacies, so that they understand what they're looking at better, not perfect, but better than what it would have been if they just come across a piece of media and how we could see it. So I guess the best thing I could explain, the best pivot I could talk about first to tee up like what we're going to talk about is the pandemic changed how people interacted with media. Before it, we could still make an argument that traditional media landscapes, print, papers had a certain way of saying what they were saying. We go all the way back to like Marshall McLuhan, who like would say like the medium is the message, which is like a very media literacy basis thing, which is, if it's in a newspaper, it must be news. If it's on TV, it must be television. And so that no longer happens because this guy, George W. Bush, he created this act in 2006 called the End of TV Act. And in 2009, this other guy, Barack Obama, turned off television, like turned it off. It's crazy to think about, but at like midnight on some day, I think it was August of 2009, it just went and it was over. Television ended. And what that meant was that the traditional broadcast model of television ceased to exist in the analog sense. A new model was replacing it, digital television. But once everything's digital, pretty much all of your media comes into your house via either a fiber optic cable or a coaxial cable. There's no more TV. It's digital media that's being translated from genre origins. So McLuhan did like a nice barrel roll in his grave, and then that was it. Now we're here. So I would just like to talk to you about like media we see and media we make, and like how we could better read that.
Yeah. I mean, I learned something very similar in journalism school, and it was set up. I was taught it in a classroom, but it was very much set up as you will not see ABC News covering Disney roller coaster failure, right? Because you have to understand the structure of Disney owns ABC News, Disney owns ESPN, Disney owns these things. So it is unlikely they will ever say anything negative about the parent company. And so that's very much how I was taught media literacy was who owns what reporters working for what thing and what they've said about it. And that was how I was taught media literacy, which you're right is a very old school mentality.
Yeah, it is. So that's interesting too. You were very lucky because I was not taught that. But I do teach that. But that is something that I took Mass 101, Mass Media 101, which is like the foundational course in college where it's like, look at this. And it was right after 9/11, like right after. So it was like that semester. So do you remember the big shift that was happening that semester? Do you remember what changed on TV?
This is going to sound really annoying, and I just apologize. I was in like third grade when that happened.
My bad. Nice. There's our age gap.
I do remember the world pre 9/11 and post 9/11. So I am old enough to remember the difference.
So the
I just
big
wasn't in
difference.
the classroom in that setting.
Yeah, it was weird. It was a weird time because like where I went to school, we not only watched it, but we had to like deal with it. It was not great. The the ticker on the bottom of the screen appeared. It used to be like only during breaking news events would be like the bottom of scrolly, and then 9/11 introduced that as like a permanent feature of television. Was like immediate news was at the bottom and like TV was on top of it.
Yeah.
Um, which was interesting because like 9/11, not to say, I mean, it was an incident of a day, but the ticker basically started creating this mode of media representation where you were kind of waiting for new news to emerge. That fall was a pretty intense time. Attached to 9/11 but not part of 9/11 was the anthrax attacks that came out, and then 3 months later, an airplane actually crash landed in Brooklyn on November 11th of that year. And like people forget that, yeah, literal in Park Slope, I think like a plane literally crashed. And so the fall was like a very busy time, but I think the ticker has changed a lot of the way that media literacy operated because now there was a sense of like, so you will know this, and from going to journalism school, there became this quote that started going around, which was like, it's better to be right than be first. Because
Yes.
yeah. And so everybody was like, speed became part of media. Like, and that shifted the way that people wanted it. And obviously today, when like there is no right, there's just everything's first. It has changed the way that we interact with media in general. But that ticker, I think, is part of that. And so media literacy, and it's like what you were just mentioning, like that traditional one, is really important because like I've asked students about corporatized media and like what they report on, and I've done it probably somewhat unethically, but this is a podcast and I can't really be caught in trouble for this. But I do a semester where I would not teach corporate media, and then a semester where I would teach corporate media, and ask the students and see how the outcomes would be, which their questions of whether or not there should be corporate influence on media. And it was so interesting because when you teach corporate media, they don't want it. They don't want corporate infusion. They want ABC to report on an accident at Disney. And then when you don't teach it, they're just like, well, they can report on whatever they want. Like this is how reporting works. And so part of media literacy, the access point isn't, there's a point before having access to the media, which is access to people like us who could actually talk to people and explain this. So we have to like foundationally, traditional media literacy lacks its like who's going to do this work, who's going to do the work for that. Um, Jumping ahead, of course. So the pandemic put everybody online simultaneously, and there was no digital literacies. Like, there's no, first off, there's no book for the internet. There's no rules. There's no like, here's how you use this technology. Which in our previous episodes, you could hear us ranting about like why this has led to like cases and problems and acts and legislation that people don't understand, and why most of the bills about the internet come from the 1990s. But when we were all thrust online to use the internet simultaneously, nobody had like a guy, nobody was like handed, there was no government like, here's a media literacy guide to what you're about to see, because now you're about to expose all media simultaneously in a form that you're not really used to. So do you feel like a shift, like you in your industries, like when you watched it, did everything change for you about that time, or was it like, time's also very messed up for me. I can't really like put a timeline on things anymore. But
Oh, yeah.
that was about where everything shifted for me.
We're in April now, and I'm mentally, I'm still in February, right? That's just like my mind time versus the reality timeline. But I think it felt less, it felt like suddenly we were, on the internet kind of walking, and then a ton of people showed up at the same time, and now it's a stampede. Like, I don't
Yes.
necessarily know if, from my point of view, the content changed, but suddenly everybody was there and on. It felt like everything was a social media emergency. So to like speed that up from 9/11, right? We were also uh global pandemic. We were also dealing with all the George Floyd situations over here in the United States. That was causing a lot of news, and it impacted a lot of what corporate messaging was going around. Um It was just a crazy time where it felt like maybe what would have happened in 3 years happened in a matter of months. And so
Yes.
that's how it felt to me.
Hmm.
Um,
I agree with that completely. You're 100% right. It feels like a time slip almost. Like everything was like very cumulative at the exact same moment. And to note what you just said about the corporate influence, the BLM protests of 2020 did in a different way than the movements had operated pre-pandemic period. It changed the way the discussions happened. And this is also not just BLM, but the Me Too movement that happened the years before. The ad industries and media industries responded to that, and they actually made that part of it, which is in many ways a long-lasting good part, but in many ways a very strange role in which the like media itself has almost been controlled a little bit differently. You know, it's like messaging itself has to be like it wasn't as free flowing. So now we have this like influence of culture on media itself, which is beyond the idea of corporate and money. So that was a distinct shift. You're absolutely right.
I mean, I think part of it too, if we take into consideration this, how time has sped up, I have not been back into an office since 6 years ago when I walked out of our previous place of employment. I'm I've been remote ever since. And I didn't know it. I didn't prepare for it. That wasn't something I was planning for. It just is a fact. And now we're 6 years out of it, and I haven't been back to an office.
That is absolutely wild. That is um I mean, yeah, it's that's not just you either. Remote work has became kind of normalized. And even in our industry, the weirdest part was that we have friends who like have setups at home where they edit Avid, which when we went to school, like Avid, you could not, that was an office job. You could not bring an Avid home, you know, like, and now they just VPN to an Avid that's at work and they just edit, you know, and that's in real time. Do you remember
Yes.
VPNs in the time with the lag? You'd be like
Ugh.
trying to make something and like it would just like take forever.
Yes, because I tried to set it up at our previous place of
Yeah.
employment. My partner and I had tried to set it up. We would have to remote into our desk. We would have our laptop and we would remote into the desktop that was sitting in our office. And there was like a 2 to 3 second lag on that thing. Um, and that's what we thought remote work was. But
And
we're
that's
getting off topic. We're getting off topic.
oh yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. But I don't think we are because it changed the way all. In other words, since the 2020s, everything's different. Everything's different from work to media flows to the way media is even made. And like I think the thing that like most people misunderstand today about media literacy is that everything is kind of like what we're doing too, which is like kind of a hub and spoke model, which means that there isn't just one part of media anymore, where it's like you go and get a newspaper and that's it. You're holding the news and you read it top to bottom and you walk away and that's the news. That piece of news also includes all of its social media, includes its Instagram posts, it includes its reels, it includes the carousels, it includes an influencer participating in the discourse, it includes somebody making a Substack that responds to it. It includes us doing this right now. That's one piece of media is now all pieces of media simultaneously. And so it may be made by a corporate industry, which is like, oh, we've hired a handful of social media teammates who break this media up into parts. Or it could be like, we've written this specifically so that it gets taken apart by its audience and gets analyzed, bringing more traffic directly to our site.
You're
And that
describing
like,
what I do for a living right
yeah,
there.
and there's a book by is it Ben Smith, Name Traffic, which is the story of BuzzFeed, where they talk about Jonah Peretti's model of like bringing people in via clickbait, and like Etan Spartz's like history of like Dose.com from the early 2010s, where it was like the invention of clickbait, which changed the algorithm. That's a whole other part that the math that runs the internet now has like a way of like being manipulated by the media as well. So media is great that it's a plural term, you know, but now instead of saying like media is, you could literally say media are, you know, like it very much is everything all at once. So how does traditional media literacy like operate in this space when it does that? So um, let's start with like let's do two examples. So when do you come across something where you have to incorporate media literacy into like operational discussions? Like when do you come across in like a concrete way?
Are you talking about like times that I have to be like, I know this is incorrect and this is not a
Yes.
fact?
Yeah. When you're aware that media because again, you come from like a more privileged space of like knowledge of this, because when you make media, we have the rare skill of like being like, not only can we read this better, but if we wanted to, we could be the bad guy. So we have a unique skill of like not do it. Hopefully, not being the bad guy. Like we're more likely to help somebody read it better.
Yeah. Well, our nightly discussions are proof of that. Okay, so if anyone knows anything about me, they'll know that I am obsessed with F1. Max Verstappen, right there. Um, and this happens all the time, and this is a probably daily discussion in my house, where my husband has come across a piece of social media online related to F1, and he's like, "Did you see this? Did you see this?" And it is entirely a rumor. And I have to have the conversation with him where I'm like, okay, how do I explain to you that based on how the username is laid out, that I know that this is not an accurate piece of data? How do I, like, I can't, I have a hard time explaining to him. I know based on how the thumbnail looks
Mm.
that this is a rumor, this is spam, this is a piece of media designed as clickbait that is untrue and has no basis in fact, right? It is there to fuel engagement for the platform, for the profile. That's it. And it's, yeah, you can, the PR side of me, yeah, there are people that leak information, and there is that side of things. I am
Hmm.
aware of that. I know that. But typically, how things like that are done are not through these accounts. If someone is ever leaking an information, it is probably a source close to Max Verstappen says. It's probably Max Verstappen's team that is saying it. I don't know if very many people know that as a strategy. That's a real thing that is happening. Um, so I try to go through and say, like, hey, because the username just doesn't make sense, you know, this is, you need to take this with a grain of salt. Or I keep
Hmm.
saying, like, unfollow that, stop, reset your algorithm now, because you can do that on Instagram. I'm like, stop consuming it, because then the more that you consume of that, the more it shows you, because it reads how long you're on a post, right? There's so much data that they're collecting that then the algorithm says, hey, you liked this, let me give you more of this.
Hmm.
uh, and then that's how you end up, flat earthing it.
I mean, it's a long slide, but at the end of that slide could be like a rabbit hole. You're right. That how did you? So that the way that media model works is very similar to any rumor mill type of thing, which is both for the team to get more attention, but also for like their stock to go up, which is like their ability to get like the branding, the partnerships, the sponsors, and everything. It's the same thing as, I mean, there's literally a magazine called Mac Rumors, and Mac Rumors is designed for leaks for them to either move the stock up and down or create hype. And that's like when you're race cars, you need hype, you need an audience, you need people to be there, and the more hype that exists, the more exciting it is for the audience, and the more reward they get from watching it. So then again, then what you're just saying too is then the media isn't just media. We're the media. It includes the audience, because if if it extends outward into the environment, it's immersive. That's immersive media. So just a rumor from a bullshit site that's like trying to make stuff up to bring clicks to them solely includes the environment around them that's outside of it. And then they may not be a bad actor where they're intending you going down to like a rabbit hole, but they're a related content that does the same job could be doing that, because it's all hype. Like the hype around conspiracy isn't exempt from like the hype of that type of attention economy. Like that's what attention economies are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So then when you're I would like to hear a little bit about your process then. Like when you're now as a responsible media creator, okay, you're aware of these systems, right? So when you have to like create media for your clients, for me, for you, and you're doing things with the awareness of how it works, what is the process? Like, can you explain that what you do when you figure these media out?
You never plan a single piece of content without planning, right? The whole thing has to work as an ecosystem. That's the way the system is built. So if you and I have a conversation, I have to be able, right? Let's take this episode for an example, right? Because I can talk openly
Okay.
about my strategy with this.
Mhm.
This is the original piece of content. It is a long format recording. From this, I'm going to generate at least 4 social media posts that are reels. They're video based to get of the clips where we're saying something super interesting or super controversial to get people to tune in. I'm going to probably break it down into a couple carousels worth of quotes so that people scroll through. The point of the carousel is that the algorithm actually shows each carousel page. If you don't engage with it on page one, it'll show you page two. And it'll show you as many times as it needs you to get engaged. So you do video and reels for reach, you do carousels for engagement. I'm probably going to encourage you to write something about it on your Substack so that we can redirect everything to a written piece of content. And we'll probably explore anyone for guest opportunities and refer back to this episode. So, nothing that I create is a singular piece of content. It has to live multiple levels, multiple platforms, multiple lengths, and I need at least a week and a half worth of content out of it to really make it a successful original long form post.
And you had a term for this, right? This is like clipping, you called it, right?
Clipping.
Like
Yeah.
clipping. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Clipping.
it's I'm I'm interested that you use that term because the only time that I heard that term used in public was like that Louis Manosphere doc where the dudes at the end were like, well, we're going to do clipping. We're going to do what they call clip farming, which I thought was just a negative act, but I just now you're like explaining like clipping is part of the process. You have to clip something so it's pulled away from its original media so it leads back. So clips are part of the media then too.
Again, using us as an example, right? In my brain, when I'm clipping, because we are trying to be responsible about it, I'm trying to take clips that would catch somebody's attention, but not mislead them. I try and do a balance of you and me so that the algorithm doesn't think this is only a male show or only a female show, right? I try to take a balance to really set up our audience, set up our tone. I try to pull clips that not only highlight your academic experience, but also highlight my real world experience so that it doesn't get labeled by the algorithm as one or the other. There's a ton, as I'm going through and clipping, there's a few things that are going through my mind that until you ask me that question, I don't realize that I do, but because this has been what I do for a living, I just innately know it and I innately do it.
Yeah. And so that okay, that brings me to the next part, which is like how the public understands media in that space because they use terms from the internet. They use terms like this, but they're not exactly clear on what those are. And like you just mentioned that like you're responsible about it, which means that there are irresponsible clippers out there, right? There are people that clip for intention of bad work, right? Yeah. Okay. So that the terminology of internet stuff is used as like kind of like kitschy. But one of the things that like I'm always like pointing out to people is like I have to remind people that the internet is not a separate place. It is not some place to go. When like literally, here's an age gap thing. When I was a kid, you would go into the computer room, and you would go play on the computer, and like that was the internet. You would go on the internet, and then when you were done with the internet, you would leave that room. But I think the mentality of older consumers are like that. The internet is something you turn off, but not realizing that the internet doesn't stop. When you bring up the algorithm includes like you standing in line at like a supermarket and scrolling. but not now. The data changes because now it's not only doing, you're not only feeding the data back of what you're watching, but it's actually doing locative data. It knows you're at a supermarket, which means that that locative data that Instagram is vacuuming up is changing the way that it understands your purchasing decisions, which means if you watch an out of context clip there, it's different than watching it at home. So the internet is everywhere. We are just on the internet. The other things that make it different are like terms that like become popular, like brain rot or riz or slop for that matter. Like all these terms become like kitschy, cute terms that people can refer to. I'm gonna bring up a thing here, but even the term like meme itself is like has changed its meaning. Like as somebody who like used to brag as my branding was like I have a PhD in memes, which is just like a branding thing because I have a PhD in uh, cultural and media. No, it's oh my gosh, it's out of the frame. I gotta fix that. It's actually somebody would probably make a note of that eventually if they don't see it. It's cultural. Can you see it? It's like crooked. How weird is that? Look, that's ridiculous. That's where is it? There it is. Cultural analysis and theory, which is like what it really is. That's my actual degree. But I studied memes, and when I studied it, I wrote the first peer reviewed paper, co-authored the first peer reviewed paper on Pepe the Frog. And you know what's crazy? Students don't know who Pepe the Frog is today.
That is so crazy.
I know. So the idea the idea of memes is just wild to me, that like now we're at a point where memes just represent mimetic culture, and mimetic culture is any type of idea that you could shrink down to something shareable and move on. So then it gets mixed up with like brain rot, which is like media clips. That's what brain rot is. It's clips from like Family Guy or CG shows or like ridiculous content. And that type of brain rot ends up just being stuff. It's stuff you consume. That's really what it is. The problem is, how do you introduce, you and I are experts, now how do we translate our esoteric deep knowledge of this to the public who, I would say generously, 95% of them know them as words. They don't know what we know about the content. It makes it a little harder for us. And so like it's easier to say it memes are jokes or memes are acts or memes are stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to bring up, I just want to share this piece just really quick because this came out in the New York Times, and this won't hold us to like being stuck to like a very specific moment or anything, but this is a very important thing to take into it, because I really think this is a really good piece to talk about. It's in the New York Times, and it was published on April 6th. So you can see it's a very recent article here. And it's written by an author named, so let's do some real media literacy here. It's written by Willie Staley, um, who does a fair amount of work on culture. You can see he's a culture writer for the New York Times Magazine. And so a lot of the work you can actually see is like digital media, Netflix, Twitter, the Try Guys. And you can
Try
see
Guys
the
is
reason
old.
it is old. Yeah, this is
Did
when
he
did
take
that?
a break?
22. Yeah, did he take a
How long
break?
does he spend on an article?
Well, this is the New York Times Magazine. So it's this writing is a lot different than typical writing, but it is still a magazine that is very popular. I was quoted one time in the New York Times Magazine by Rayan Harmachi, who is the editor in chief of Wired now, and that was the most amount of times people recognize my name. Like, so it really does have an uplift. It is a very popular thing. It's really important. So his work here is very important because it has to deliver a certain amount of information. I became aware of Willie Staley when he wrote How the Manosphere Became Mainstream Entertainment, which inspired my book, How the Manosphere Became Culture. I took it a step further, that it's not mainstream entertainment, it's everything. But let's go back to his piece here, because he actually introduces the idea of forget the AI apocalypse. Memes have already nuked our culture. And like, okay, media literacy, that is headlines. For those of you who don't know, headlines are not written by the author typically, they're written by the editor. They are designed for what you and I do, which is draw views. Okay, they're designed to bring you into the article. It is clickbait. They're written, people criticize headlines because it changes the voice in many cases, the like passive voice versus active voice. It changes the way you could actually see a corporate bent. Like, let's say ABC were to write about an accident at Disney, it would, instead of saying like a ride killed a passenger, it would be like a passenger died at Disney. Like, so it would be a different thing than like what the action is.
like, right, like it's kind of it's written from the like it's the passenger's fault. It's not Disney's fault.
Right. Yeah. So it
Like, how
takes it
dare
off
they?
of the weight, takes the action away. Like that's sort of like when, yeah, it changes. So this is like memes have already nuked our culture. That's a pretty bold statement, but I just want to do a really quick 2 or 3 sentences from this just to like give an example of like what we're talking about here and how hard it is to tell these stories of internet culture when you're dealing with this. First off, this is really a great framing device. New York Times is just if you read the New York Times and you really close read it, it's always important to understand the framing device. First off, the New York Times is the paper of record. That's what they call it, which means when you read the New York Times, you're expecting the writers and stuff to be like exceptional. They're also extreme fact checkers. Like I remember my one quote, 2 different editors called me to do fact checking. So it was one quote. And so that's the most amount of factual information you could find is probably within the gray lady, which is a nickname for it, which is that it's supposed to be fairly objective. It means it's not directly from the author. So the framing device is usually very good. And here it is. A friend told me a story about her son. He's about 9 years old. So it's a frame within a frame. It's Willie Staley's friend's son. So now we're 2 separate objectives away. Okay. So now we can tell the story. And he talked about the story about 6'7", which is also funny that they're talking about 6'7" now because that meme is now very old. To be clear, before we go further, 6'7" is an absurdist meme. It is not designed to mean much of anything. It's really just a noise, if anything. It's more of like an oral meme. It's like a tick. It would be what I consider like a sound meme or an audio meme.
How crazy
And
is
it's
it
also
though that memes went from being a digital visual consumption to now they're an audible part of like they're becoming audible.
right. It isn't just audible, it's actionable. There are really two memes get mistaken for like these 2 different things, but like there's a beginning to all these stories. There's a challenge beginning. So you go all the way back to the cinnamon challenge, what created the viral model of challenges. So there was a challenge that happened on the internet, and all challenges are derivative of that. And then there's like where audible memes come from, which is what's known as IRL memes, which is the 6'7" is a derivative of like planking or like the ice bucket challenge or like owling or like Tebowing. These are all viral things that you could participate in so that it would create content. 6'7" isn't content. It is actually an oral meme, like AU oral meme. It's designed for the ear. It's designed solely so that people they know you're on the inside. And in the case of the inside, I mean children. Okay. The parents literally ruined the 6'7" meme because they started doing it, and children are just like, I don't want to do this anymore. This article is about this boy's devastation at finding out that it means nothing. And I guess as a 9-year-old, that is pretty devastating, to find out that like you're dealing with like nothing. I don't know. I don't remember what 9-year-olds was like because I was playing with Ninja Turtles, but like it was I'm sure like having like the vacuum of knowledge is like pretty terrifying, if you think about it. So he goes on and he basically breaks down what the 6'7" meme is. The 6'7" meme was revelatory because of the immense gap between its symbolic payload, non-existence, and its cultural penetration, pretty big. It worked like a tracer die running through our information ecosystem. That's very colorful writing for something that's very stupid. So it is kind of nice. But what he leads to here is this. It's too obvious to say. What most of what people do on social media is copy other people. And here, what he's actually talking about is memes. And this is why media literacy makes it very difficult to use traditional media literacy on new media. And I would even go so far as not even calling it new media anymore. It's just media. It is what it is. This is particularly apparent if you flip over to the highly algorithmic feed for you on X, Instagram Reels, entirety of TikTok. And this is where the media literacy person in me jumps. Like it gets a little nuts because for my version of media literacy, when I bring up something like for you on X, I find it somewhat irresponsible not to caveat that with what is X? What is X? And so when you're talking about X, the Elon Musk owned version of Twitter, you're talking about a terrible environment that has very low borders and content moderation and is the place you and I were talking about, which is like the top of the slide's bottom, where you're falling directly in those rabbit holes. A lot of people who I'm sure lie about F1 are using X to engagement farm, and they're sending people down algorithmic deep dives. And I'm not saying the New York Times is irresponsible with this. What I'm saying is that it's a surface level interpretation of media that is very, very hard to diagnose. Brain rot, like 6-7, is literally that. It's not designed for much. To write an entire article on this is an explainer, which is nice. It's basically saying that, yeah, AI is dangerous, but memes are really as infused our culture. And that he's right. But it's also something that I said in 2015. It's now been 11 years. So it is strange for academics to start seeing work they've been doing in the media literacy space emerge into the mainstream 11 years later. When people like Aidan Walker, who writes How to Do Things with Memes, Ryan Broderick from Garbage Day, Taylor Lorenz of UserMag, these people are deep dives into this stuff. A lot of what we talked about with COSA and like the social media addiction, that comes from Taylor Lorenz's work. Because they're considered alt media, they're not considered like media literacy spaces of like traditional media things. And I think to do our big takeaway here is that just as media exists immersively, alt media is part of the media information system. Like what we do is also part of that New York Times article. And your story about F1 is part of the F1 media ecosystem. It's not just one thing. And it's nice that you're like helping your husband make sure that he's not reading something that is designed specifically for engagement bait. But how do we, what I guess let's do here, like what are some good quick pieces of advice that you would give for people to make sure their eyes are open?
I mean, I think what always catches my eye is if it's a username that has like too many periods in it for some reason. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they didn't get they got there late. Yeah.
Which like is neither here nor there, right? My dog's account has a bunch of underscores in it, but he has the content to back it up. He has a photo that looks super legit, right? It's a glamour shot of him that I had taken. Right, my social media is set up in a way that, you know, it reflects my name. It is my photo. Even our social media that I just set up for this show, I added our faces to it because that legitimizes it,
Mhm.
right? You see our face, you know it. It's not an abstract logo that I created in ChatGPT or in Canva, right? Um, the it is so hard to verbalize the thumbnail, right? It is so hard. Usually, it's too many words. Like
Oh,
that's the first thing that if it's too many words, if there's words, first red flag. Um, because in my point of view, it's if you put words on an image, the algorithm ranks it lower. I don't know if that's still the case or not. That was very much the case 10 years ago, right? If the copy doesn't look, you know, it used to be grammatical errors, right? There wasn't someone editing, there wasn't someone fact checking. If there's no sources in it, right? Even F1, when I get a news alert, it is one of the few alerts that I let happen on my phone. A news alert comes through from F1, I know that there's source material in it, which there is. There are people's names attached to it and said quote, and you can trace it back if you need to do the backlinking, right? All of that infrastructure is built into it. If it's rumors, first red flag. If it's you know, a quote taken out of context, which happens a lot, especially with Max Verstappen nowadays. Massive rumor mill happening that he's going to retire from the sport because of the new 2026 regulations. I think half of that is perpetuated by his team because he is unhappy in his situation. But you can trace it back to a specific interview that he said where an initial quote was taken out of context. And that
mhm.
has fed months of content now. They're still going. So I tell my husband, I don't believe it until I see it either on the driver's account
Yes.
or posted from the F1 account, or I get a news alert on it, right? The paddock very much operates in a rumor mill environment. It's how contracts are done, it's how people switch jobs, right? They feed that beast themselves. So this is a good example to use it in because it very much does exist as a part of the ecosystem, but you have to be able to filter out where that's coming from. And if you can't trace it back to a source, then I disqualify it as information and flag it as irresponsible, honestly.
So you said both of mine, which is that if it feels too good to be true, you're right. I often, you were saying like it's hard to explain a thumbnail, but like your instincts are built in because you've done this, you've built this, you've spent a decade. But when you see something for the very first time on a feed and it has no other, it's the first time you've seen it, it's not, you can't immediately assume that's real. You can't, that's that.
Do you watch a lot of stand-up comedy?
Yeah.
There's I forget the name of the comedian, but he has a bit where he's talking about his mom and AI deepfakes. And he's like, I don't know how to explain to you that I'm just chronically online.
I'm like, Mom, that's not real. Stop sending it around. It's not real. How do you know? They always get so indignant about it. They're like, how do you know that it's not real? Because the font is off and the resolution of the image is blurry and that lighting state doesn't even make sense for that image and that's not standard dimensions for a news article, okay? I can't give you this knowledge. It's like Malcolm Gladwell, blink. I've just seen so much shit on the internet, my brain instantly filters it.
But it's so true. It's like, I do not know how to explain to you that this clip of a moose running through someone's house is not real and it's AI, but I only know because I'm like chronically online and probably mentally ill and like...
Right. What's the difference between a broken brain and media literacy, right? Like there's, yeah, right. Because the amount of time, the amount of exposure we've had to content gives us a skill set of being slop first. Like I'm also skeptical. So I come with a skeptical heart. And like, that's what I always tell my students is like, I want you to be skeptical. I don't want you to be cynical because in the end, like what you just said is important. A lot of this is by design. It's designed specifically to create the hype mill, the market itself. That's the same with tech rumors. It's the same with F1 rumors. It's part of the media. It's built into it. It's part of the media for all of media's history too. Like hype mills have like just been part of how media works. It's literally what it is. The other part of it is context, which you said. If you can't contextualize it, and sources are important because like if you're reading political news, you will often hear like the caveat. We asked 9 people, we were all offered anonymity. Excuse me. They were all offered anonymity to speak off the record. When they say that, you're like 9 people is a pretty good number. But when you hear like 1, you're like, that's just some guy, you know? And like you could also see it, like you could hear like someone close to, like you say, like someone close to Matt Verstappen. Like it's probably someone who's literally close. It's probably a teammate whose designated role is to speak to the press in that role. And like very often you're like people close to the vice president of the United States. And it's like, that's probably JD Vance. Like it's very often it's those sources are because journalists have a specific access to those people. They're not like you or I asking the question. The journalists have to tell the story. They're part of that role too. So they are doing that. But readers often feel like the need for confirmation bias, which is like they want things to be true. So that is, if you don't find context for the information, and that's exactly like what I was criticizing with the New York Times piece, which is when you just say the For You page on X, that is, to me, is like, X isn't a place children should go to go find anything. It's, if you take a risk of opening that app in public and you're going to be seeing things that like you could get in trouble just for holding that app. So that I understand the note of like, it's an algorithmic feed, sure, but it's also a feed that's designed specifically for the role of engagement itself. But because platforms are disparate and there's so many places for news to go and all these clips to emerge, it's media itself has to just basically be brought back. It has to be, when you're doing media literacy analyses, it has to really be gut checks, slow down. I always say patience, move slower. It doesn't matter how fast things are coming because now it is post first, get it right second. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. Verify by not going backward into the author and all those things, because that you should know just by not having by having a weird name and no picture. You should also know that information is rough. but find that same information somewhere else that isn't linked to that piece. If it's independently sourced over and over again, you're like, okay, now they're building a trust on that. And if there's context, meaning it's not just the subject, but actually the tendrils that come off that information, then you start going, now I'm understanding veracity. I'm understanding how news happens.
So I want to know if you think, I think I'm going to draw an allegory. I'm pretty sure that's the right word to use. And tell me if you agree with it or not. I think clipping did the same thing to media literacy in a digital media environment that opinion shows on 24-hour news networks did to media literacy in a traditional media environment.
Yes, that's more of an analogy. And the allegory would be like the environment itself. But I guess you could use it in both cases here, because the environment of commentary, I guess is what you're talking about, like 24 news. So 24-hour news, there is no 24-hour news. I guess that's the best thing. It's like to report on news 24 hours would be inundation for the viewer and also inundation for the researchers. So there isn't enough news to report for 24 hours. And if there was, there would be the audience wouldn't be able to get it because it would be too long of a time to ingest it. So what they invented was the commentator. Like they invented the Tucker Carlsons, they invented the Jon Stewarts, they invented the people that would comment on the media itself. Now, the piece that I was analyzing in the New York Times is an ideas piece. That means it is a perspective. It isn't a news part, but is so the perspective can be written from a commentary perspective. It is veracity because it comes from the gray lady, but you're right. Like, and then so clipping itself is that, but microscopic, I guess. Like it takes like the big idea of commentary and turns it down into like digestible, like you could eat them. Like it's just, yeah, I guess you're right. Like that's a really good way of looking at it, which is that the world of commentary on media becomes the portability of media later on when the flows become more portable. I guess that's it, is that now that we handhold the device, that's an important part of digital literacies in general. The ergonomics of the device itself, this is why the joke always happens with millennials need the big computer to write an email. It's the ergonomics of the device dictate the media itself too. The verticality of it is because it's ergonomically in your hand as vertical, which means the clipping requires that shape, form, and time, because when you're staying in line, you're going to want to consume 5 clips, not just one, because you need to have the attention span for real life around you too. So what you're watching is meta commentary. So your allegory is right, because really it's meta commentary on the idea of commentary itself. Like, so it's, yeah, it's all the way down that spiral. Yeah. So it is. So media literacy becomes harder because now it's more micro than macro. It's micro in a macro world, and it really requires us to do a lot of extra reading. And again, my big takeaway here is we got to slow down. If you really want to know information, when you see something, enjoy it. Don't let media literacy be your burden, but also like understand like you have to do some interpretation. You're responsible for that type of media too.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think that's it for today.
Yeah, that was fun. That was a good one. I like this. This is something I'm working on. I'm really excited to consistently work on updating and working with media literacy, especially in the age of AI and memes, because we have to do the work. And like you and I doing this show, like I'm very proud of us doing this too, because we're doing the contextual evidence of like stuff that is usually left to be interpreted by the audience, and we're doing an additional layer of interpretation for people too.
Well, and I feel like this episode's very important, especially because as we move into the age of AI, these literacies and these frameworks are important because people are experiencing brain rot with overuse of AI. I hear it from a ton of people across a ton of different industries. It's very hard. So we have to teach it. We have to know about it in an updated context that reflects the current world that we're experiencing. So to tag out the show, if you want to continue to learn more about the internet, culture, anything that's happening in the digital media environment, like, subscribe, share anywhere, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, even Facebook.